The joke landed, the crowd roared, and somewhere behind palace walls and Montecito gates, a storm allegedly began brewing that no one saw coming. Because this wasn't just another late-night punchline tossed into the celebrity echo chamber, this was a moment that felt like a line had been crossed in. Permanent ink, and now whispers are swirling that Meghan Markle is weighing her options while Chris Rock, unapologetic and unbothered, is standing firm in a way that has turned a comedy jab into a cultural standoff. The tension didn't explode quietly, it detonated in front of cameras, under bright lights, with the kind of precision that only seasoned comedians dare to attempt when they know exactly how far they're willing to go and exactly how much backlash they're prepared to absorb. And insiders are quietly suggesting that this time the backlash may not just be social media outrage, but something far more calculated. That opening stretch alone reignited everything people thought had cooled down, and what makes it even more volatile is that Chris didn't hesitate, didn't soften the edges, didn't wrap the punchlines in diplomacy. Instead, he dissected narratives that have hovered over Meghan and Harry for years and did it in a way that many viewers interpreted as dismantling, not teasing. And here's where it gets dangerous, because once a joke shifts from entertainment to perceived character attack, the word legal starts floating in rooms it normally wouldn't. Rumors are now circling that Meghan's advisors were not amused, that conversations allegedly happened behind closed doors about whether comedic commentary crossed into reputational harm, and that legal teams may have quietly reviewed footage to determine whether satire had stepped into something actionable. Nothing officially confirmed, nothing formally filed, but the mere suggestion has turned a monologue into a battlefield. What truly intensified the situation was not just what was said, but who was saying it and how confidently it was delivered. Because Chris Rock isn't an internet provocateur hunting clicks, he is a veteran with decades of experience navigating controversy, and when someone like that decides not only to go there but to refuse any hint of regret afterward, it shifts the narrative from momentary roast to principled stand. And that's exactly what appears to be happening now. Reports suggest that intermediaries quietly reached out, that subtle pressure may have been applied for clarification or softening, and yet those close to Chris insist he has zero intention of issuing an apology, framing his stance as defense of artistic freedom rather than personal attack. And that refusal alone has doubled the spotlight on Meghan's potential response. The reaction online was instant, polarized, and ferocious, with some arguing that comedians must remain fearless and others insisting that powerful platforms come with responsibility, and somewhere in the middle sits the Duchess of Sussex, a figure who has spent years battling narratives she claims misrepresent her, now possibly confronting another wave amplified by live television. The idea that she could consider legal action is not entirely out of character given past disputes with media outlets, but it also carries enormous risk because pursuing comedy legally can backfire, painting the claimant as humorless or intolerant of satire, which may be precisely the trap critics claim is being set. What complicates matters further is how quickly other voices piled on, transforming a single segment into a broader commentary avalanche, and when momentum builds like that, it becomes less about one comedian and more about a pattern, a perception, a collective signal that the protective bubble, once surrounding certain public figures, may be thinning. If Meghan does pursue action, even indirectly through warnings or demands, it could ignite debates about censorship and celebrity sensitivity, and if she doesn't, silence may be interpreted as strategic retreat or quiet endurance. Either choice becomes a statement. Behind the scenes, speculation hints at advisors urging caution, reminding that legal threats against entertainers can trigger a Streisand effect, amplifying the very material one hopes to suppress, and yet pride, principle, and precedent all weigh heavily when reputation feels under siege. Chris, for his part, appears unfazed, reportedly telling confidants that comedy has always thrived on discomfort, and that apologizing for satire sets a precedent he refuses to endorse, especially when he believes he spoke within the bounds of commentary rather than malice. And that final clip is the one that truly lit the fuse, because it reframed a sensitive chapter in Meghan's story in a way that some audiences cheered and others gasped at. And once that line aired, there was no rewinding it, no quiet deletion, no editing it out of cultural memory. The question now isn't whether the joke was sharp, it's whether the reaction will be sharper. Legal experts observing from afar are divided, noting that public figures face high thresholds for defamation claims and that satire traditionally enjoys broad protection, but they also acknowledge that context matters, implication matters, and repetition can matter, and that's where things get Markle. What we're witnessing may not just be a feud between a comedian and a duchess, but a collision between narrative control and comedic defiance, between carefully curated image and spontaneous stagecraft, and the refusal to apologize has turned what could have faded into another late night highlight into an escalating saga. Insiders whisper that Meghan feels the constant drip of ridicule undermines serious causes she associates with, while supporters of Chris argue that public life invites public commentary, especially when media interviews and documentaries keep stories circulating. It's a loop feeding itself, and now every silence, every statement, every absence becomes scrutinized for meaning. There is something undeniably symbolic about this standoff because it touches on larger cultural fault lines, how far satire can go, whether celebrity status shields or exposes, and who ultimately controls the narrative once it leaves the confines of carefully edited interviews and enters the raw unpredictability of live television. The refusal to apologize is not just a personal decision, it's a declaration, and the rumored consideration of legal action is not just a protective instinct, it's a potential escalation. And the world is watching to see which direction this chessboard tilts, because once lawyers enter comedy, the punchlines echo differently. If this was the spark, this is the wildfire, because once the rumor of legal action began circulating, the energy shifted from spectacle to strategy, and suddenly the conversation wasn't just about what Chris Rock said, it was about what Meghan Markle might do next. And in Hollywood, that question alone can freeze rooms and ignite group chats simultaneously. Behind glossy gates and quiet conference calls, it's being whispered that consultations may have happened, not necessarily to file anything immediately, but to evaluate leverage, optics, and precedent, because Meghan is no stranger to legal confrontation when she believes narratives cross a line. And that history alone gives weight to the speculation, whether confirmed or not. At the same time, Chris Rock's camp appears almost amused by the chatter, signaling privately that he stands by the material, that satire is not slander, that live comedy is not a press release, and that if the culture begins policing punchlines, the art form itself starts suffocating under the weight of fear. But what makes this situation uniquely volatile is not just the personalities involved, it's the timing. Because public appetite for royal-adjacent drama has never truly faded, it has merely evolved. And every time Harry and Meghan step back into headlines, the reactions intensify rather than diminish. There's a sense that fatigue and fascination are coexisting, that audiences feel both oversaturated and endlessly curious, and when a comedian articulates that tension on stage, it resonates in ways scripted interviews cannot control. The alleged possibility of legal action, even if it never materializes, has already reframed the story as a power play rather than a punchline, and that reframing may be more consequential than any court filing could ever be. Meanwhile, insiders claim that certain executives are quietly monitoring the situation, not out of panic, but out of pragmatism, because whenever legal rumors swirl, advertisers and networks start calculating risk exposure, and although nothing has formally escalated, the mere suggestion of litigation forces contingency conversations that otherwise would never happen. Yet paradoxically, that same suggestion strengthens Chris Rock's public image among supporters who see him as standing against perceived hypersensitivity, and in an era where free speech debates flare daily, refusing to apologize becomes a branding move, whether intentional or not. He doesn't need to issue a statement, his silence reads as resolve, and resolve in the face of potential backlash often fuels admiration as much as outrage. There is also the unspoken layer involving Prince Harry, whose absence from direct response only thickens the intrigue, because when narratives revolve around both of them, silence from one can feel strategic or strained depending on perspective. Some speculate that advisors might encourage restraint, reminding that escalating conflict with comedians only prolongs the news cycle, while others argue that allowing repeated ridicule without pushback invites more of it. It's a psychological chess game where each side must decide whether confrontation empowers or diminishes them, and neither choice guarantees safety. The broader entertainment community appears split in subtle ways, with certain figures quietly backing Chris under the banner of comedic tradition, while others privately sympathize with Meghan's frustration at being perpetually reduced to punchlines rather than recognized for initiatives she once highlighted. This division doesn't erupt publicly because Hollywood often prefers ambiguity over allegiance, but the tension exists beneath polished red carpet smiles. And the audience, the ultimate jury in any cultural dispute, remains fiercely divided, dissecting clips, debating intent, replaying moments, analyzing tone, and assigning moral weight to words delivered in seconds but debated for weeks. What complicates everything further is that satire, by its nature, exaggerates and simplifies, while lived experience is layered and complex. And when those two realities collide, interpretation becomes the battlefield. Chris Rock may view his material as commentary on public narratives that Meghan herself has amplified through interviews and documentaries, arguing that visibility invites critique, while Meghan's perspective, as some suggest, may be that certain themes are deeply personal and weaponizing them for laughs perpetuates misunderstanding. Neither position is simple, and that complexity fuels the fire rather than extinguishing it. If legal action were ever formally pursued, it would have to clear the formidable hurdle of proving false statements presented as fact rather than opinion or satire. And experts note that public figures face particularly high thresholds, but the optics alone of even exploring that path could alter public perception. It risks reinforcing narratives about intolerance of criticism, yet it also signals unwillingness to accept what one perceives as mischaracterization. Every potential move carries consequence, and that's why the rumor itself may be the most strategic card currently on the table, because it applies pressure without commitment. And then there is the undeniable truth that controversy sustains relevance, and relevance in the modern media ecosystem is currency. Whether intentional or incidental, this clash has reignited discourse around both parties, drawing fresh attention to past interviews, past specials, past statements, and stitching them into a continuous storyline that feels almost serialized. The refusal to apologize keeps Chris Rock centered in that narrative as defiant, while the possibility of legal action keeps Meghan positioned as assertive and protective of her image. It's not just a feud, it's a reflection of how fame, media, and comedy intersect in an age where every joke is archived and every reaction amplified. Ultimately, what makes this saga so gripping is that it transcends a single night on stage and morphs into a broader cultural question about who controls the narrative once it escapes controlled environments and lands in the unpredictable arena of live performance. The laughter has faded, but the reverberations remain, echoing through headlines, timelines, and private conversations alike. Chris Rock's refusal stands as a line drawn in comedic sand, while Meghan Markle's rumored contemplation of legal recourse hovers like a gathering storm cloud that may or may not release rain. And until one side makes a definitive move, the tension itself becomes the story, pulsing beneath every reposted clip and whispered insider claim, leaving the world suspended between punchline and precedent, waiting to see whether this remains a war of words or transforms into something far more consequential.